on which pocket I put it in. There was an elderly couple, married 52 years, sitting out on the front porch and rocking. It was real quiet. You hear the crickets chirping in the background. Finally, the wife looks over at her husband, who's drinking a sweet tea, and asks this question, or makes this statement. For 48 years, you have not told me you loved me. He kept rocking, took a sip of tea, didn't say anything. She said again, I said for 48 years, you have not told me you loved me. He said, I heard you the first time. If I ever change my mind, I will tell you. See what this joke means. Now that's a good joke. I'm sorry. What this world needs is a lot of things. Jackie DeShannon said in the year 1965, what the world needs now is love. Well, it needed it back in 65 and it needs it today. It's interesting. We use that word love so flippantly. We can tell our wife we love her, and almost in the same breath talk about how much we love red beans. We can talk about how much we love God, and in the same breath how much we love to fish. We get kind of confused when we start talking about that word love. What do we really mean? I know that my love for my wife is much different than my love to fish or red beans. But you see, we use that term pretty flippantly, and sometimes we may not really know the way that we're using it. You know, it dominates the world. Have you ever thought about how many songs is about love? Well, you're fixed to find out. 100 million. 100 million songs about love. Right now, I bet in 20 seconds, I could ask you to name 5, and you could do it with time left over. You know, these are just a few I thought of. The Beatles, All You Need Is Love. Elvis, Love Me Tender. Huey Lewis, The Power of Love. We just keep going on and on and on. It has dominated books on love stories. It's dominated the world of sculpture. It has, in fact, even in the social media, if you type in the word love into your Google, everybody does this Googling these days, there are over 13.9 entries. I should say that should be 13.9 billion. I forgot the word billion. 13.9 billion entries. Now, unfortunately, most of these entries deal with hooking up with the opposite sex. You see, that's really how love is understood today. If you don't believe that, watch TV. Listen to the way the modern world uses the word love. It is an abuse and a misuse of this great word. What I want to do tonight for the time that we have is to talk about what love is. You know, I've titled this What the World Needs, but it's really what the church needs also. Because I think we're just as confused on this word as the world. Notice, Tina Turner once said, "What's love got to do with it?" Now, that's a little bit different take on the word love. What's love got to do with it? Well, it has a lot to do with it. Is love important? 1 John 4, verses 7 and following. In fact, let's read this together. 1 John 4 and verse 7. Be turning there. Now notice how love works. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. If you are a child of God, you want to be like your Father. And if you're like your Father, you're going to love one another. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. You say, I know God and I love God. Well, do you love your brother and sister? Okay. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. In this, the love of God was manifested toward us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Now, this is interesting. This was a little bit different twist than what we might have been looking for. We'll think, well, since God has loved us, then we ought to love God. That's not what he says. If God has loved us, we ought to love one another. You know why? Because if we're like God, God loved us, he loved one another, and we love one another. It goes without saying we love God. God is love. Our love not only reciprocates with God, but it reciprocates with one another. John 13:34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Notice, commandment, not a suggestion. There are certain people that sometimes I get a little bit frustrated with, and I'm always telling them, God makes me love you. Now, that's tongue-in-cheek, but there's some truth to that too. God does make me love you. That's a command. If I don't love you, then I don't love God, so I love you. You don't love me, you don't love God. And we'll talk about what love is here in a few minutes. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. You know, a lot of people today get tattoos, and these tattoos are supposed to mean different things for people. Maybe a military rank or something of that nature, or perhaps who you're married to, or your grandkids or kids, all of that. Supposedly, that's your identifying marks. If you're Christian, you don't need a tattoo for this one, because you see, our identifying mark is love. We don't need a tattoo for that. Love is action. You know, we talked about this morning, worship is not passive, neither is love. Love is not a passive thing. It's active. Just because I walk in here, climb this pulpit, and preach to you does not mean I love you. This is not the only action that I mean, it does, but be with me. Sometimes it doesn't. Some people, some preachers, but that's another story. But my point is this. Just because I go to a church building doesn't mean I love that church. I should. God commands it. But it doesn't mean that I do. How am I showing it? How do I show my love toward you or those around me? You see, that's the key. It's a very active thing. 1 Corinthians 13:34, twice in 3 passages, Paul wrote, without love, I am nothing. I can give my body to be burned. I can give all my goods to the poor. But without love, it's all for nothing. I can baptize 50 people. But without love, it is nothing. Love is an action word. Matthew 22:36. In trying to trap Jesus, one of the doctors said, tell me, what is the greatest commandment? Well, Jesus looked at him and said, I'm going to tell you the greatest commandment. Love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second is like to it, love your neighbor as yourself. You see, out of all of the commands of the Old Testament, Jesus said, those two hang the law. And you know, I got to thinking about that, and I look at love God and love your neighbor, and I think about how it relates to the 10 Commandments. It's amazing. If you love God, you're certainly not going to go chasing after a bunch of idols, right? If you love God, you're going to honor Him. If you love others, you're not going to steal from them. You're not going to abuse them, kill them. You know, love is the difference. Well, what about today? Has that changed? Jesus would say no. Really, the Word of God hangs on those 2 commandments. It is the greatest command, and still is. Madalyn Murray O'Hair has quite a reputation. She was able, I believe it was in 1963, because her son was attending a school and they had a Bible reading and a prayer. When she confronted the school about that, she wanted to take her son William out of that class so that he would not be subject to their religious beliefs. The end result, they said no. And she sued the school. And the court upheld her decision, which we're all very familiar with. Basically, single-handedly, she got prayers and Bible out of the school system. Now, it's guns and knives in the school. 2 juveniles opened fire on the parade, the Kansas City Chiefs parade, and killed several juveniles. She also founded the American Atheist, an association that was a profit organization, even though it was considered nonprofit. But she was the head of that organization. She was brutally kidnapped. Her, one of her sons, and a granddaughter. The man who kidnapped her was a member of the American Atheist organization. And one of her followers. Even after being paid the sum of money and gold coins, by the way, he put them in a unsecure locker and they got stolen, but that's another story. Anyway, in 1995, they found her body and the body of her son and granddaughter. He had killed all three of them. With her, they found hundreds of handwritten notes. Handwritten notes. 6 times, at least 6 times on those notes was this: would someone somewhere love me, please? Would somewhere or someone somewhere love me, please? She had never felt love. Now, with all that she did, it's hard for us to find love in our hearts, but it's a sad thing whenever that statement is made by anybody. Would it have been any different if she understood what true love was? I think it would have. Now, whose fault was that? I don't know. Hers? Yes. Somebody else's? Probably. But the consequences was the same. I think it ironic that someone who was an atheist killed another atheist. And I could make the argument that he just did what came natural with him, just like the wild animals of the forest, just like a lion killing a zebra. It was for his betterment. So was he wrong? By the atheist definition, I'd say no. But of course, by the moral code that we have in our society and given to us by God, yes, he was. But I do think that's interesting. At any rate, what is love? John 3:16. Mentioned this morning, so I'll go over it quickly. This is the best definition of love I've ever seen. For God so loved the world. Okay, now, get ready. We're going to talk about God's love. You want to define God's love? Here it is. Doing what is spiritually best for others. You know, this world stinks. We could compare it to a pig pen. It is a cesspool of sin. We're not that far removed from the flood when all the thoughts and intents of the hearts was only evil continually. Why on this earth would God want to save us? Which will lead to the last point. But the next one, or this one, doing what is spiritually best. Love wants to accomplish what is spiritually the best for people, for mankind, for those around us. For God gave His Son, regardless of the cost. It cost Him His Son. It may cost us our pride. It may cost us a number of things. It's doing what is spiritually best for others, regardless of cost, that gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes on Him should not perish, whether deserving or not. Can anyone say that we were deserving of Christ's death? Can we really say that? Can we? No. There's not a one of us, and I don't care how good you are, we don't deserve that kind of love from Jesus. But we got it anyway. So we put it together. Love is doing what is spiritually best for others, regardless of cost, whether deserving or not. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of our lives today. I think it's a beautiful description of what love really is. Agape love. What love is not. Some people say, well, we have to love no matter what. Well, agape love, we always love the soul. But love does not necessarily mean acceptance. For example, if there is a man that I think a lot of, which there's a lot of them, like I'm about to say, yet his behavior is such that he is not a Christian and does not behave like one, I cannot, will not accept his behavior and love his behavior. I will love his soul, but I can't love his behavior. Nor can I condone his behavior. I can have dealings with him, but I can't have fellowship. Paul talks about this in the book of Corinthians, about casting that one to Satan, that he might not sin, that he might learn not to sin. Don't you know that was hard to do? But basically they did it, and they did it out of love. And we know the outcome of that story in 2 Corinthians. He returned. That love and that tossed him off to Satan, if you can excuse that expression, but delivered him to Satan, brought him back. You know, one thing about fellowship, before someone can miss something, there has to be fellowship. You can't miss fellowship if you've never had it, or if you don't have it. Fellowship is something special, and it's involved with love. That's what cements our fellowship together. We're talking on Sunday mornings about our worship. The love and fellowship goes hand in hand with our worship. And you're going to see something through worship. First of all, there's that vertical worship, but there's also the horizontal or vertical love, but there's also the horizontal love and fellowship. We love God, we worship God. We love each other, we worship with each other. There's a bonding there. Fellowship is a bonding. It brings us together like nothing else. The world can't begin to understand that. Love has to be tough. You know, when Jesus was talking to that young man, Matthew 10, verses 17 through 21, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, well, keep the commandments. They were under the law at the time, so keep your commandments, or keep the commandments of Moses. He said, well, I've done that since I was a youth. What lack I yet? Jesus said, okay, if you want to be mature and perfect, go and sell all that you have. But you know, there's a curious thing that is mentioned by John before, by Mark before Jesus says that. He says he looked at the young man and he loved him. Then he said, if you'll be perfect, go sell all that you have. Then the young man went away sorrowfully because he didn't want to do that. Out of love Jesus had for that man, and he would still tell him what he needed to do. That's true love. That's true love. Again, it cost that young man because he wasn't willing to do it. And it cost Jesus because he loved him. And he had that bond and tie with him. So it cost him because the man didn't do the right thing. That's tough love. Love described 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, kind, does not envy, does not boast. Let's play a game. Let's do something a little different. Let's start over with this list, and let's read it a little bit differently. This kind of scary. Terry is patient. Terry is kind. Terry does not envy. Terry does not boast. Terry does not have an inflated ego. Terry does not behave unbecomingly. Terry does not seek his own desires. Terry is not easily provoked. Doesn't have a temper. Terry does not keep a record of wrongs done to him. Terry does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth. Love bears, believes, and hopes all things. Love never fails. Now, see, we get a little bit personal, and that changes. It gets a little bit more difficult. You know, we read the Bible sometimes, and we'll look at it and say, oh, that's good stuff. We need to realize that's, oh, so-and-so really could use this. Well, what we need to realize is we can use it. And when we personalize it, it brings it home. For example, let me just talk about one for just a second. Love doesn't keep a record. It doesn't hold a grudge. Does Terry hold a grudge? Can I forgive? Which is something else that we'll look at just a second. You know, Jesus Christ is the epitome of all these things. In fact, the reason why God hasn't struck us down already is because of his love and his patience. God is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any man perish, but that all come to repentance. Now notice this. Jesus, here he had a man betray him 3 times. After the man said, Lord, I'll never forsake you. I won't betray you. 3 times he betrayed him. Did Jesus keep a record of Peter's wrong? 50 days after his resurrection, or after the Passover, prior to his resurrection, that apostle that once betrayed Jesus stands up and preaches the gospel throughout all of Jerusalem. He and the other 11 baptized 3,000 precious souls. Jesus gave him that opportunity, even though he stumbled and fell. He was penitent. And he was allowed by God to preach that sermon. Then at the end, once again, the temptation of betrayal came along. But this time, Peter wouldn't betray him. Legend has it he was baptized. He was crucified upside down like Christ, except upside down. Love never fails. There's a lot of things in this world that is brittle, will break, will fail, but love is not one of them. Love forgives. Think about the prodigal son. Basically, he thumbed his nose in the face of his father, took his father's inheritance, went to a foreign place, spent it on riotous living. When the money was gone, the friends were gone, and you know the rest of that story, but he came home. You know, the tenderness can hardly be understood when you think about the Father runs up to him. He didn't wait for the Son to come up on his porch. The Father ran to him. That's love. If you don't know how much Father, that's love. And you know the rest of the story. He forgave him. Jesus on the cross, they had ridiculed him, divided his garments, crushed a thorn of a wreath of thorns on his head, beat his back in such a way that it was just mangled flesh, dropped that cross into that hole, would slap him, spit on him. Then at the very end, he would say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. Do we have that kind of love? In John chapter 21, Jesus had made an appearance to the apostles once again, this time on the shore. He approaches Peter. Peter, do you love me? He used the word agape, the same word that we're looking at here. It is also a social kind of love. Peter said, yeah, Lord, I love you. Well, then take care of my sheep. Pasture my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Once again, using the same word, agape. Yeah, Lord, you know I love you. Tend to my lambs. Peter, do you really love me? Now he's using a different word. He's not saying, do you agape me? He said, do you phileo me? Phileo is a word for friendship. It's an embracing. It is a closeness, intimate kind of a word. It's almost like a family. Storge is a family word, but this is just about close as that what it is. It brings us close together to embrace. Lord, you know all things. This is the same man that denied him. Lord, you know all things. You know what's in my heart. Yes, Lord, I phileo you. Do you love Jesus? How much do you love Jesus? We sing a great song, Oh, How I Love Jesus. But how we show him we love him. Remember, one of the ways we show God our love is when we love one another. Are we showing our love to one another? Tonight, one of the identifying marks of the Christian is our love. That's our brand. That's our tattoo. If you truly love Jesus, you will keep his commandments. For this is love, that you keep my commandments. John 15, I believe 3. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you love God, you'll keep his commandments. John tells us in 1 John, and then he adds, and his commandments are not burdensome. You see, love takes away the burden out of the keeping of commandments. Since we know what it is that God has done for us through Jesus Christ, it is not a burden for us to keep his commands. Tonight, do you love God? Do you love Jesus? How much is that love costing you? What's involved in that love? What kind of commitment do you have attached to that love? Well, first of all, there has to be a commitment to be a Christian. If you are a Christian, then you have that kind of love, or should have that kind of love. If you're not a Christian tonight, I want to beg you to make that decision to become a Christian. Commit to that kind of life, to that kind of love. There's no way I can begin to stress or to picture the kind of love that God had for us. I can't do it. I don't have the words. I have the thoughts and the emotions and the feelings, but I don't have those kinds of words. I just know how much He loves us. Enough that He'd give His Son for us. Therefore, let's give something back in return. Let's give Him back our lives. The invitation is yours while we stand and sing together.